Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Brandon J. Manning, who's Assistant Professor of Black Literature and Culture in the Department of English at Texas Christian University. He's also the author of the just published Played Out, The Race Man in the 21st Century Satire, published by Rutgers University Press. Of Played Out, the great Robin R. Means Coleman writes, Played Out is an instantly canonical book. It tackles narratives of the race man, racial uplift, and respectability politics through the lens of satire to reveal the enduring mythos of acceptable Black social justice work. Through this brilliant, deeply researched book, Brandon Manning rescripts the pathways to social transformation and progress. How are you doing today, Brandon?
I'm doing all right. And yourself?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us on Left to Black. Let me start by asking what your path was to Played Out.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and one that I like to think about a lot. So I was completely enamored with Chappelle show when it originally came out, and really historicizing that. It was an entire moment in the early 2000s that I think opened up a number of conversations. And then as I was in graduate school, there were a few things a few tensions that I wanted to try and reckon with. One, particularly this idea that folks would assume that Black literature or expression is solely a site of trauma and pain. And then two, the various ways that certain narratives opened up and evolved across the late 20th century, and where I found Black men's expression via literature, plays, film, etc., really opening up, especially in response to what I situate as the rise of Black women's writing and Black feminism in the 70s and 80s. And so it was interesting to think about then the role that satire had and our incessant need to really cling on to and create these Black funny men.
Yeah, I was struck when you described the way in which satire for Black men, particularly, over the last 40 years or so, functions in a way to allow white folks an out, in terms of critiques around social justice, right? This idea of thinking about, a Dave Chappelle, and he's the one that really resonates, I think, in this moment around this, is being so witty, right? And so smart in his witticisms, right? He's not funny the way these other Black folks are funny. And it allows him to make certain kinds of racial critiques in which white audiences feel as though they have room to play, right, in terms of their meanings, right? And then you suggest the way that it also allows them, folks who do kind of comedic, white folks who do comedic work, to say racist things and engage in racist narratives and get that same out pass because of satire. Talk to me a little bit, as you're researching this and looking at so many of the great works of Black satire. I always felt that Black audiences had a kind of ambivalence around satire. On one part, because it gave white audiences that latitude, right? And didn't always seem to say what it meant. And also because it becomes a vehicle to do self-critique of Black folks. So talk a little bit, if you could, about the kind of ambivalence that some audiences might have around Black satire, some Black audiences.
Yeah, no, so I definitely think that there has been issues in relationship to audience, in relationship to representations of Blackness, even within satire, that I think in turn prompt that issue with the audience. And so, yeah, it's been an absolutely kind of interesting space to think about Black masculinity and the critiques that they're able to level against Black communities. And one of the things that I think is that I talk about in the book is that for certain Black folks, it offers up this kind of in-between space. You can be both inside and outside, right? Yeah. And that kind of liminal space that Black satirists take up oftentimes has them, on the one hand, within their work, very much evoking a particular tradition, very intertextual, introspective, but maybe outside of those pages, there's a little bit more of a kind of tenuous relationship to where they imagine their own selves within this kind of broader canon. And here I'm thinking in particular of like Percival Everett or maybe even Beatty in this moment. And so yeah, and to your point, I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting that those writers are celebrated in these ways precisely because they give multiple audiences these kind of these various registers where they can enter into and exit out of the meaning that they want to kind of map onto the critiques that they're reading.
Yeah. You begin the book talking about Kendrick Lamar's performance at the 2018 Grammy Awards. And I remember the performance well. I don't remember until I read it, him framing it as Black satire. You know, in this kind of post-Lemonade moment, you know, so many Black, you know, hip hop artists, you know, Black crossover pop stars wanted to make a kind of singular political statement in the work that they were doing, right, to a broad audience, right? And I had to check the timeline because there's some ways in which, you know, Donald Glover's "This Is America" is illegible without what Kendrick does at the Grammys, right? You know, I hadn't thought about that connection until, you know, reading this chapter and doing kind of the timeline. That being said, you know, when I think back to that Kendrick Lamar performance, it wasn't funny, you know, which is why the claiming of it as satire struck me as really interesting on his part. So talk about what drew you to that particular performance at the Grammys.
Yeah, you know, so one, I'm a big fan of Kendrick Lamar and the performances that he had on the Grammy stage. I believe it was a couple years earlier than that, where he had that really provocative performance from To Pimp a Butterfly. And so when he released Damn, he came out with this performance at the Grammys, and it was, you know, when he labeled it as a satire, right? And I'm so happy that you brought in Donald Glover in the conversation as well, right? There's a particular way that I think Kendrick Lamar in that moment recognizes that by giving it the label of satire, right, he potentially elevates his performance to be read across a number of different ways. But at the same time, there's always that kind of catch-22 where it could also be kind of dismissed in particular ways. And so it becomes interesting then that he then uses Dave Chappelle from the audience to help make legible some of those moments from the performance itself.
Yeah, because I think that there's a way for many mainstream performers, white performers, you know, satire is always already read as a form of critique. Right, and social critique, right? So whether or not it's funny or not, right? So the idea that he would claim that, and of course then claim Chappelle in that makes sense. You argue throughout the book that when we think about, you know, the place for the Black male performers in terms of satire, that there's a particular kind of labor that's taking place. One, this idea of Black male vulnerability. The second one, the idea of Black male interiority, right? Seeing these aspects of Black men that we don't normally see, and also a kind of real ambivalence around, you know, how legible Black men are, how known or seen, you know, Black men generally are in the context of these performances. Could you talk a little bit about these three dynamics?
Yeah, you know, in many ways, the project is really indebted to L.H. Stallings' work. I was so fortunate to read her article "Punked for Life," where she where they talk about Paul Beatty's White Boy Shuffle. And really think about the way that Paul Beatty is playing with masculinity in that space, as well as Erica Edwards' work, and thinking about, you know, legible, charismatic, and this leadership and this need and desire for this kind of race man, this monolithic figure. Alongside Edwards and Stallings, I think similarly, the book comes out of a deep interest in Kevin Quashie's work. And this move towards the interior, and really thinking about, especially if we're thinking about masculinity, right? This commitment to, like, how do we improve it, right? So much of your work, in fact, you know, New Black Man, how do we improve these modes and expressions of Black masculinity? And for me, Horton Spiller's, Black men need to embrace the female within kind of introspective moves. It really centers and grounds the work. So for me, the move towards vulnerability and interiority and even ambivalence is a bit, it came from my early concern that people were laughing away a lot of what was on the page or on the screen, and were not really fully understanding the stakes of being able to make these critiques, and these satirists in particular putting themselves out there, in part because of the way that race was operating with gender and this kind of broader erasure around Black men's emotional lives. And so I really wanted to open up these satirical spaces to kind of accentuate, for me, what I felt like was the kind of broader stakes of their critique.
One of the things that really impressed me with the book is it's a particular move that you make around thinking about Black male performance of satire, and the way that satire is deployed to offer particular critiques of not just Black women, but Black feminism in general. The obvious person here is Ishmael Reed, right? And in this moment where we talk about so many people being canceled, I mean, there's a way in which, within the Academy at least, Ishmael Reed has legitimately been canceled because so much of his satire was directed towards these critiques of Black feminism and obviously Alice Walker in particular in this kind of moment. Right. And Trey Ellis kind of fits into that trajectory. I have to tell you, though, I had to give pause in rethinking the work of Percival Everett, particularly in Erasure, right? Because Erasure does so many other things, that are so important to this, this project of satire. But when you think about, who is the person that is the character that's consistently under critique, right? It is this kind of popular Terry McMillan satire type figure that comes up. And then also George C. Wolfe, right? To think about, a text like The Color Museum, right? And it's a challenge to deal with The Color Museum because you got to find it. Right. There are portions of it that you can find a bit and piece on things like YouTube and what have you. But talk about why it was important to put those four men in particular as writers in conversation around the way that's deployed, right, to critique Black feminism. And then I want to ask you after that to talk about, what do we do with these Black men performing in drag?
So for me, and I'm happy that you made the distinction there, and I don't see Percival Everett engaging in that tradition in the same ways as his predecessors. And I very much recognize, but to your point, and that's kind of the links that I was hoping to make, he's able to, right, it's still the same kind of villain or foil, right? And it's indirect, right? Because really it's the publishing industry that he critiques in Erasure, right? And it's not her, but she becomes a stand-in for so much, right? Juanita Mae Jenkins. And so for me, what was really interesting, and I'll have to go back, when I was in grad school, I was fortunate enough to be in one of Simone Drake's class as she was thinking through masculinity for her book project, When We Imagine Grace. And you had come up to campus, and I was having a conversation with you probably early in the morning, I shouldn't have, on the way to the airport about masculinity and satire. And you brought up Oreo as a wonderful kind of exception to this kind of broader gendered landscape.
The Fran Ellis novel.
Yes, Fran Ross, yes. And so it was interesting. But one of the things that I found in really what is a real embrace of Black feminist writing and Black women's writing in the latter part of the 20th century is that I very much understand Black feminist texts as trying to create a blueprint for an alternative Black masculinity moving forward, right? Like, how can we move beyond, as I brought up Spillers earlier, right? This investment in American heteropatriarchy. How can we focus and redirect to a kind of communal and collective kind of approach? And so for me, it was interesting to see what the response to that intellectual moment was on the part of Black men. And it's something about the 90s in particular, the late 80s, early 90s, where we begin to get these critiques. And one, as you say, right, it kind of aligns itself with these kind of class dynamics as well, in part because of this kind of growing multiculturalism. We could talk about maybe the Cosby effect or what have you, right? But it oftentimes gets aligned with these various class critiques. But one of the things that seems to be happening kind of consistently across it is that almost in the same way that I mentioned that satire gets taken up within the kind of public American imaginary as a way of grappling with difficult subjects, but also being able to potentially fall back on this idea of it's a joke I was playing, there seems to be a way that Black men, in a kind of pithy, witty way, were using their witticism towards these kinds of critiques of Black feminist texts. And so yeah, I wanted to do a little bit of charting of what that looked like. And the book itself takes up texts that are kind of past that moment and into this 21st century moment and are less involved in that kind of work, and instead are thinking about what some of those earlier texts were doing still, right? Trey Ellis's Platitudes is about a kind of Black masculine interiority, but that still uses Black feminism as a foil to that a little bit. And so, you know, I was interested in these kind of contemporary texts that were centering more so this kind of interior space.
Yeah, and not even just, you know, Black feminism as a foil, but an uncritical form of it, right? It's not even as if these books, you know, definitely in the case of Reed, actually take up the critiques of Black feminism seriously, right? You know, it's this idea that these are women who are embracing this in an uncritical way. To think a little bit, you know, beyond the context of the book, one of the things you talk about is that when we think about satire in general, and black satire in particular, we're really talking about the perspectives of men, right? We don't see, you know, how women, you know, play out in that context, right? And so, you know, how do we think about this particular moment where there's suddenly been a proliferation of Black women's voices, you know, in sketch comedy as one example of this, right? You know, so to think about you know, the work that Issa Rae, you know, obviously did with Insecure, but also before that, Awkward Black Girl as a form of satire. The work that's being done with, you know, a television show like Abbott Elementary right now, and things like that. Do you think we're at a moment where there is a shift where now when we think about Black satire, you know, there are more non-traditional cisgender male voices that are going to be at the table?
I think absolutely. And that's kind of where the book leaves us. It's kind of the conclusion. And that's hopefully the turn and pivot that the title, you know, in terms of played out in terms of this kind of singular narrative and investment in Black men being situated or having to grapple with this race man trope, that we can kind of move beyond that, in part because, you know, one of the things that I think the novel takes up is this idea that, you know, you're able to better recognize my humanity if you recognize my humor. If you're like, I can bring you into my thought process, kind of where I am on certain things, if you recognize how I see the world, right? And humor and meaning making happen in those kinds of ways in these satirical spaces. And so, you know, I'm really hopeful that for Black women who have been extremely prominent in this moment, and Black queer folks more broadly, that they can, I don't know, finally have that be realized in a broader popular way and be taken up and celebrated in those ways. Because we see the benefit that it's had for Black male satirists who have been able to level these kind of critiques around masculinity, but that Black women, Black queer folks haven't been taken up and celebrated in this kind of popular space in the same ways for those same kind of necessary critiques.
Yeah, a couple of contemporary questions for you. You know, if there's a foundational figure in thinking about 20th century Black satire, you know, it's George S. Schuyler, and Black No More. And, you know, even now when I teach it, it kind of blows students' minds, right? That, you know, that this is something that now has almost been written and published 100 years ago. How do you feel about, you know, the presentation of something like that on Broadway, as it's now being presented, with Black Thought and a few other, pretty well-known creatives, to take this particular historical piece of Black satire that's been so critical, I would argue, to the development of a Black critical sensibility, throughout the 20th century, whether we're talking about literary criticism, musical criticism, there's a way in which Black No More is always there at the table. What does it mean to try to translate that to a mainstream Broadway audience at that?
Yeah, no, it is interesting this moment to think about, Skylar, and I think you're absolutely right. Students both love the text, and one of the things that I love about it is that it, instead of being so first-person narrative driven, it is this kind of broad approach to looking at the various systems. And it's funny you bring that up, because part of the reason why I felt like I had to write the book is because when Aaron Magruder's the cartoon show for Aaron Magruder, the Boondocks, starts, when it goes on to Cartoon Network, I am like, I want to watch it with blinders on. Like, is there a code that I can put in the TV? Because I want to laugh at Uncle Ruckus, but I don't want everybody to laugh at Uncle Ruckus.
That's absolutely it. Yep.
You heard of vitiligo? Shoot, well, I got vitiligo.
And so I could see there being similar type moments with the presentation of Black No More. And what I in particular appreciate about my students in this contemporary moment is the way that they are so invested in dragging Max Dasher in his incessant love and need for white women in this way. And so yeah, and then that coupled with the preface that, it's interesting that with all the CRISPR type stuff and the sci-fi element of the novel, right? Like, I feel like Skylar actually felt like this was a kind of inevitability that he was writing. Yeah. And so to think about, like, even how race and technology are operating in this moment, it's all interesting.
Whenever I think about the moment in which the Nation of Islam is created, I always think to myself, there's no way Master Fard Muhammad didn't read Black No More. Right, because Yaqub's devil comes out of Black No More. I mean, that's essentially what the argument is. But another kind of contemporary moment here, we talked about, you talk about Dave Chappelle in the book, and Dave Chappelle is a really interesting kind of figure, right? Because he's engaged in a certain comedy and satire that's not wholly embraced by Black folks.
Right.
He's not someone who becomes a race man, if you will, until the television show, right? Until the Chappelle show. And then there's a kind of expectation that he's always going to perform that race man,
right?
Dynamic, right? Which he doesn't always in a way that satisfies Black folks, right? Well, he wasn't always that in the first place, right?
Right.
It's like the Kanye thing, right? Kanye is most Black when he says, George Bush doesn't like Black people, and then folks are disappointed when then that's not his politics. Like, well, it wasn't his politics. It's always Kanye's politics was always Kanye. Right. There was just a particular moment where Black politics, coalesced around the politics of Kanye. But I say that to think about, one, how do you feel about, some of the recent work that Chappelle has done, in some of his stand-up work that's gotten a lot of criticism, particularly in terms of the anti-trans dynamic of it. And to think about kind of a fellow traveler with him, but someone who's a little older, someone like Whoopi Goldberg, who's also had this very fraught relationship with Black audiences, right? Because, it's never been so simple to her. How do we deal with, a kind of critique of Whoopi Goldberg and comments that she might have seen that are made a controversial, and also see white comedians get latitude in that regard, in ways that Whoopi Goldberg doesn't, right? Because we don't think, as you say in the book, white people don't like funny Black women. Right. That's not a thing. Right. They want funny Black men. Right. So, funny Black women are largely invisible. Right. And I'm sure there's a fair amount of people who are looking at Whoopi Goldberg's statements, not to get too deeply into them, who don't actually think of her as a comedian. Right. In the same way that if that was Dave Chappelle in that role, it's like, well, he's a comedian who's being funny.
Yeah. No. I'm happy the book is out of my hand, right? I don't want to, but I feel like as soon as I hit send, the closer came out, and there was so much more that I wanted to put on the page,
Understood.
Yeah, yeah. And so, the last space that the book kind of takes up Chappelle in is his performance 846 that he does after George Floyd, and it's kind of this Black Lives Matter infused piece.
This man kneeled on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Can you imagine that? This kid thought he was gonna die. He knew he was gonna die. He called for his mother. He called for his dead mother. I've only seen that once before in my life. My father, on his deathbed, called for his grandmother. When I watched that tape, I understood this man knew he was gonna die.
Some might argue masterfully, I argue problematically, has been able to stand in and align himself with various kind of rhetorical talking points in this moment that allows him to not only be this Black comedian who oftentimes feels like he's upholding certain truths for the Black community. And we can talk about what those truths are and the community that he sees. That community is primarily relegated to Black male celebrity. And so it's his defense of his fellow Black male celebrities that he's primarily putting up. But yeah, one of the frustrating pieces about the closer is that he, I don't know, this becomes the place where that need to be able to speak about race and this idea that he is the race man holding up Moses at the river, and that becomes really problematic. And so, and you can kind of see that, right? I mean, he ends the piece by essentially telling queer communities to leave Black communities alone. At a particular erasure of Black queer folks, of so much. And so yeah, no, I had so much that I wanted to be able to say about Chappelle in this moment. And I appreciate, I don't know, that as he was coming out with this, he said that this was going to be it. But then it's also this kind of, you brought up Kanye earlier, it's this obsession with this kind of broader meditation on Black celebrity, this kind of broader thinking through what does cancel culture mean, and where does the line, right? Chappelle is really interested in whatever that line is. And I think you're absolutely right that while he has sought to represent a large swath of, or people assume that he's like speaking their language, there are a number of folks that he does not speak for. And it's important that we, one, recognize that, and two, the thing that I at least appreciate on Chappelle's part from 846 is that he recognized that he was no longer the best spokesperson to do.
Absolutely.
Even as he then kind of, goes back into that for the closer. But yeah, and for Whoopi Goldberg, it's interesting to think in this moment more broadly about cancel culture, right? I remember, what was it? It was a couple years ago where Alice Walker, folks were just like, oh, I don't know about Alice Walker. And yeah, and so I think one of the things that more broadly we kind of need to grapple with is, one, what are the latitudes that we're able to give people for what's happened, what's being said? Two, to your point, does that happen along these kind of gendered lines, right? And so, are there a number of people that will come to the defense of fill in the blank, Chappelle, whomever, but as soon as you have a Black woman who engages in similar and oftentimes much less severe, I don't want to quantify, but kind of discourse and rhetoric, or position themselves in a way, like Chrisette Michele, for singing at Trump's inauguration. Right, they are like thrown away in these ways, and in really troubling ways that, when we're reading Phyllis Wheatley or Zora Neale Hurston, like I tell my students, like it is unfortunate, but historically, as much as America doesn't like to see funny Black women, they have an issue with Black women in general, right? And that it's too easy, and so yeah, it's definitely a broader issue.
One of the moments in Played Out that made me laugh out loud was your description of telling folks what you're working on. Black men, Black masculinity, and satire. And immediately folks are going, oh, so you're going to talk about all these brothers who dress up as women.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that particular dynamic in terms of the work that you, and the expectation that the labor of your scholarship is solely going to be, focused on that particular dynamic, and why that dynamic seems to be so troubling.
Yeah.
For so many Black men.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Part of what I think helped to reinvigorate the project was Kenan Thompson saying that he wasn't going to dress up as any more woman characters on SNL, but then also around the same time saying that there just hadn't been enough funny Black women to audition. And so, ever complicated, but I mean, I recognize that for a number of Black men, this kind of care and concern and investment in representations of, I'll say, cisgender, heteropatriarchal, or I'll just say cisgender formations of Black masculinity are important, right? And there's this kind of constant need to police the ways that masculinity gets situated or aligned with the feminine, or what some may say is effeminate. And I think that has a particular kind of intellectual trajectory out of Black Power movement, out of an Eldridge Cleaver, and this kind of discourse around castration and all of these other kind of fears that white American manhood had on Black men, right? And a kind of gendering of liberationist movements in general, right? That focused on Black men. And so I recognize that, but I also find it troubling, one, that I think embedded in the question is never an investment of what these representations look like or mean for Black women, right? Because it is making a mockery or a buffoon of them, and is, reveling in stereotyping caricatures in ways that are deeply problematic for Black women. And two, the posturing and positioning itself can also come off as its own form of like misogynoir, where it's like, I want to be anything but a Black woman. And so that was never something that I wanted this text to take up or delve in any real, in any way at all, but in any real way. But I kept getting asked the question so much that I felt like I had to put in there why I'm not doing that, and what the stakes of that kind of line of questioning means for Black men in this contemporary moment. And again, I recognize that, maybe in Kenan Thompson's case, he was playing the long game to get more Black women on SNL, right? But in the moment, it came off as kind of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this question. Are you willing to grant the work of Tyler Perry as satire, right? And I'm asking this question as someone who is tremendously ambivalent about Tyler Perry, right? In the sense that, his ability to produce content is really unmatched, in terms of Black content creators. The multiple platforms, the control of his own studio, all of that kind of stuff. And while I typically am not a fan of Tyler Perry's products, I do find myself having a very special place for the Aunt Medea character and where she shows up, because in many ways that stuff to me is legitimately funny. And like you said earlier about Uncle Ruckus, right? The kind of things that I want to laugh at, I just don't want everybody laughing out.
Right.
But are you willing to grant, what Tyler Perry does in some ways as a form of satire?
That is a good question. And I have my own reservations about Tyler Perry, and specifically his representation of successful Black women, and this knee-jerk reaction for a number of prominent Black men to feel like they've got to teach Black women how to be the best version of themselves. You know what I mean? And so that said, I think one of the things that the project is gesturing towards by the end of it is how much is the idea of, and even at the opening in terms of Lamar, how much of the idea of what we imagine as wit and witticisms comes from this kind of Anglo Eurocentric kind of tradition, right? That inherently privileges men historically throughout, right? That said, Perry is obviously ushering into these spaces in the way that he is. And similarly, I cannot deny the fact that for a number of folks, he has taken them to the theater in ways that they hadn't gone before, that they're going to the movie, and that they feel represented and seen in a way that they hadn't before. And so it is always a catch-22. I don't know in terms of like including him in this broader kind of articulation of this kind of genealogy of satire, that I would include him in that genealogy, definitely in terms of like humorous expression and where that kind of aligns itself with the tradition. But yeah, I mean, so much of what I see happening in satirical spaces, especially through first-person narration, and for these Black men that are writing these narratives, is a kind of attention to shifting a kind of landscape around masculinity and race. And you know, the thing that always has troubled me about Perry is that I feel like he feels he's creating for Black women in a way that's productive for them, and that, I don't know, it becomes scary at that moment.
Yeah, that's a great answer. We've been joined today on Left of Black by Professor Brandon J. Manning, who's Assistant Professor of Black Literature and Culture in the Department of English at Texas Christian University, TCU. He's the author of Played Out, The Race Man in 21st Century Satire, published by Rutgers University Press, just published. And Robin Means Coleman says of the book, through this brilliant, deeply researched book, Brandon Manning rescripts the pathways to social transformation and progress. It's been wonderful talking with you today.
Thank you.
Professor Manning.
Appreciate it.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.